You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. Event Horizon started between three friends. Each had developed individual skills over the course of their various careers. The key point was that all our skills complement each other, and with so much upheaval happening in the job market, it's extremely important to identify opportunities that can help you in these next few years. That's why we're excited to be sponsored by Skillshare this week. With Skillshare, you can identify new career opportunities by working on various skills that interest you. You probably know of Skillshare for its creative-focused classes, including photography, film, and video. But Skillshare also has hundreds of career-focused classes. With that, we recommend the class Creative Confidence and Silencing Your Inner Critic. It's a great way to find who you are while also overcoming imposter syndrome. Our goals on Event Horizon are to continue to advance the quality of the show with a future upgrade to our visuals. Take advantage of this opportunity to explore the Skillshare class library. The first 1,000 people to use the link at the top of the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Tony Freeth and Ben Bacon. Dr. Tony Freeth is a founding member of the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project and an Honorary Senior Research Associate at University College London. He holds degrees in mathematics from Cambridge University and Bristol University. His work on the Antikythera mechanism has been published in the journal Nature, as well as other prominent journals. Ben Bacon, an amateur archaeologist and furniture conservator in London, meticulously examined ancient markings on cave paintings dating back 20,000 years, finding compelling evidence that they could be associated with a language. Teaming up with 2 professors from Durham University and 1 from University College London, they embarked on a collaborative effort to decipher the significance of these enigmatic symbols.
Ben Bacon and Dr. Tony Freeth, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Now, one of my fascinations, both of you actually, one of my fascinations in life is ancient cave paintings, because these are artistic treasures that just give a window into a time long past, much earlier in the history of Homo sapiens. Yet it's still us that did that. These magnificent walled paintings, like at Lascaux, where we can still tell what those animals are. You know, we know what an aurochs is, even though the actual natural form of it is extinct, or an Irish elk or something like that. We can see that and compare it to the fossil record and see that these people were, actively watching and hunting these animals. But there's always been a mystery. There's also dots and a certain symbol that are associated with some of these cave paintings that I suppose everybody thought maybe that meant something. But you have an idea on what they mean. Give us an overview of that.
There are many, many, many signs in the caves. They're probably, they're millions. They're in the millions. There are so many of them. And I think they're under-recorded or under-reported. They're studied by the specialists. But when it comes to the public, people see the paintings, partly because they're so overwhelming, and partly because they're so easy to process intellectually. We can understand them instantly. We make this instant connection with these people of the past. And the study of what we call the signs, or the words, or the communication systems has generally been considered secondary to this. But I think in the past 5 or 10 years, there's begun to be quite serious interest in examining them, seeing if we can find any patterns within them that might indicate the communication of meanings. And it's beginning to come to the forefront. There's our team that is doing this. There's a team at Tübingen University, which is trying to use computers and machine learning and pattern analysis using computer programs. And then there's another new team starting up in France to do this. I think we may have made a bit of a breakthrough, because we can demonstrate that 2 very specific patterns, which is a clear image of an animal, an identifiable animal, such as a horse, as you just said, together with what is generally 3 dots, is a temporal signature that is indicating something about the behavior of that animal. And these patterns are so consistent across the caves that it is statistically probable that we're right, that this is a form of seasonal recording of their behaviors. And it's a shared system that they use, which is very logical for hunter-gatherer people, that they keep track of the animals. So this is, in a sense, a scientific recording system, keeping track of the animals, knowing where they are, when they're there, what they're doing. And it allows you to begin to plot out the world, not using the seasons in terms of their warmth or their cold or whatever, but using a more scientific, measurable system that allows you to be much more precise about what the animal is doing, and also to record the information permanently, to put these dots on the caves with the animal, that then becomes a permanent record that's available not only to the person who made that image, but to the community and to posterity and to the future. I think it's cognitively and intellectually and culturally, I think it's quite important. It shows a grasp of each other and a grasp that you will be together in the future. It's a cultural and community thing, as well as a scientific thing, a lab book, if you like.
This idea of a community thing, you see these symbols geographically, placed very distantly. Different caves still have these same sorts of things, and they're adjusted perhaps, for differences in latitude and differences in weather. And it almost seems to me anyway, and shoot me down if this is incorrect, that you could have somebody from Spain that's migrating and they go, north into France and they see a cave. They can interpret that and know what to expect from the local wildlife, correct or not correct?
I think what you're saying is completely correct. I think it's a bit more complex than that, though. I think that in a way, if the signs and the cave layouts, the animals in the caves, that they're local, but the way of presenting them is universal. So a person in Spain could go to, say, Eastern Ukraine and be comfortable with the iconography there, with the way the animals are drawn. And a lot of the signs will be the same. In fact, most of the signs will be the same. And we seem to have demonstrated that though the time will vary and the latitudes will vary, that a basic system of measuring the calendar from the time the snow melts or the rivers begin to flood in the warmth of spring is a constant used across this world, which we can demonstrate. So it shows that all these people share their information. The signs, the symbols, if you like to call them that, they're universal as well. I can't think of a region where they have their own unique vocabulary of signs. The signs are used uniformly. We've been studying a sign recently, which is the lozenge sign, which is in use consistently from southern Spain, southern Italy to Russia. It's the same sign, has the same meaning. So there was great mobility and great exchange of ideas and culture, I think, intellectually and culturally and artistically.
Dr. Freeth, your view?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I think ever since the discovery of these extraordinary paintings in caves in the 19th century, people, in a sense, have been blinded by the beauty of the artwork. It is just stunning artwork. And everybody who sees them, they're just awestruck by how beautiful the paintings are. And this has blinded them to seeing what Ben has uncovered, which is essentially the beginnings of science, a scientific system. I think that's really important. And the other thing Ben touched on was the universality of this system over huge time frames from, 26,000 years ago to, I don't know, anyway, huge time scales and huge geography from southern latitudes to northern latitudes. And that there's a universal system tells us things about these cultures and societies, which is completely mind-blowing. I think it's a real revolution in how we see Paleolithic people.
Now, how vital was this information, do you think, to living in Europe of those ages? Would this have been life and death?
It was to do with survival, certainly to do with survival, and plotting the seasonal behaviors of animals because they relied on animals as prey was certainly to do with survival, a central part of survival. That's what the system's really about.
Now, Ben, in your view, just as a variant in this question, is this the first glimmer of civilization? This sort of interchange of information, is this the beginning? And another scientist has coined this phrase, the beginning of the human dataome, the point at which we began to collect information and start passing it generation to generation. Is this the beginning of society?
What I would say is we've probably always done that orally, but the problem with any oral systems, there's no record of it. So we can postulate that these people were almost certainly doing this well before they could write it down. But this marks the transition from an oral tradition only, which is vulnerable. Oral traditions are very vulnerable, people having good memories and passing that information down accurately. And you can painfully acquire information if that group of people dies out and the information dies with them. But I think this is scientific because it records very specifically and very accurately, and in a scientific way, which is recorded at the time, written down at the time. So there's no going back in your oral tradition and trying to think, well, what happened last year? And people start arguing about when things happen. So I think this is the beginning of scientific data recording. I think it has another value as well, which is that it pulls the group together. You're sharing art, you're sharing a writing system. It pulls you together. And that allows you to be more effective and more efficient. Human beings on their own are hopeless at food gathering, especially in those hostile climates. You need cooperation, and critically, you need to communicate your ideas so you're acting in harmony. And I think that these do it. When you put this information on a wall or on a rock, you are recording something that has happened, but that's not its value. What you're effectively saying is next year at this time, at this cave, this animal will be there in large vulnerable herds and we will attack them next year. So that's quite a profound thing. It's a concept of the future and of having a shared future with others. It's quite extraordinary as you go into this, just how broad the implications are, both in terms of writing, in terms of maths, in terms of social interaction, social grouping, scientific recording, the beginning of precise scientific recording. I think it's quite significant what's happening here.
Can it be said that this infers a level of early astronomy? In other words, in order to compile these, they had to be watching the moon and know what the moon does as a calendar, and that it shows that even at that early time, anybody can notice the season, but noticing the moon moving through the sky is a little, that's a little bit different. That's science and astronomy right there. I mean, we obviously have to infer that, right? That these are lunar calendars.
Can I answer this first and then pass over to Tony? What is interesting about this is that the moon has no effect whatsoever on the Earth and the temperature. It's completely unrelated. It's the sun that has the effect on the Earth, and it's the sun really that you want to track. But the sun proceeds too slowly to be of much use to these people. And the idea of using the moon, which is a much shorter unit, it's a unit of 28, 29 days, which can then be subdivided into the phases, gives you a very week by week, quite accurate way of recording what you really want to record, which is the sun. And I think this is genius, that you can use something that's unrelated to what you want in order to make the thing that you want to understand comprehensible. That's a big change in the world, I think. And over to you, Tony.
The basic units with which ancient peoples must have reckoned time are the day, the lunar month, and the year, because these are the evident changing astronomical phenomenon that they would have observed. The problem with these is that they're not very compatible in terms of numbers. There's 365.25 days in a year. There's 29.53 lunar months in a year, and so on. So these are difficult in terms of reconciling the month of the year, but they definitely must have used the lunar calendar. When Ben first approached me, it was because he knew that I'd done research on an ancient Greek astronomical calculating machine called the Antikythera Mechanism, which includes a very sophisticated lunar calendar, extremely sophisticated lunar calendar, that works on a 76-year cycle, subdivided into 4 19-year cycles. I think Ben wondered if that sort of calendar might be included in these signs in the caves. My own view was that the ancient Greek calendar is a mathematical calendar, brilliant mathematical calendar based going back to Babylonian astronomy a bit earlier, but that the Paleolithic peoples would really not have had access to this sort of calendar and this sort of sophistication, mathematical sophistication. And we had a lot of discussions about the calendar. My own thought was that they reckoned the lunar cycle by simply observing the moon, starting the month whenever it was convenient for them, maybe at full moon or new moon, or first crescent moon, and then simply counting months as they happened in the sky, because it's an easy thing to observe. But they didn't try and fit the lunar month into the year. Their scope of interest was the lunar months from what Ben has called the bonne saison, the start of late spring, really, to the end of the year. And as you go into winter, there's no real animal behaviors you want to track. So you sort of lose track of these months, and then you simply start again next year without worrying about the incompatibilities between the lunar cycle and the annual cycle. And the great thing this also does is that this calendar is based on months defined by a meteorological calendar. We have a universal calendar where the 1st of May is the same, whether you're in Brussels or in Madrid, But they had a calendar which started with some meteorologically based concept, something to do with the change in the sun's temperature as you move into spring. And the advantage of this is that it's the meteorological calendar that determines the animal behaviors. So it becomes a universal calendar regarding animal behavior. That's why it works over such a huge range of latitude and altitude. You don't suddenly get the numbers changing when you go to a northern latitude or to a high altitude, because in those places, the spring starts later. So that you then start counting the lunar months at a later stage. You're not talking about a universal calendar. And so this, I think, explains why these correlations are so extraordinary. They are extraordinary correlations between the number of dots and lines, for example, on an animal behaviors. They're just remarkable.
There's an obvious logic to it. When the cold ends and the animals start moving, that's what's important to you in that environment. So it doesn't surprise me that you would begin counting from that and then ignoring solar calendars and things like that. That's different use. But I guess they may well have been aware of it. Now, Ben, could we have a sort of a bias here? In other words, maybe we're seeing a partial system. We see the caves, but we don't really have anything like carvings on trees or anything else they might have been using to create signposts of sorts. Do you think that we only have a partial view of their total system, so to speak?
I think so. I think pretty much anything organic would clearly have rotted. And I think they probably used wood or branches, especially as counting sticks. They put little notches in them to record, day-to-day information. But there is a surprising amount of, there's not just the cave paintings, which are great permanent things, but there are enormous numbers of small rocks called plaquettes, which are basically small pieces of slate or sandstone, maybe the size of a teacup saucer, something like that. They're quite small. And this is where the bulk of the information is recorded, and very, very densely. So you'll have, say, on one of these small plaquettes, say the size of a small dinner plate, you have an image of an animal, and then you have quite dense patterns of engravings around it. And they will be recording information about that animal, often over 10 or 20 years. Like when that animal came to that cave, recorded over 20 years. Did the animal mate there? Was it an aggregation ground? Was it a birthing ground? Is especially recorded. In addition, as well, I think they're also recording other information, such as what plants are available at that cave and possibly what rock resources are there. So you need to think of it not just in terms of the cave wall, but in collections of these plaquettes, which can often number thousands. I think at Apollo, there's something like 5,000 plaquettes that they've recovered from the cave floor, which have enormous amounts of information on them. So as well as the cave walls, you've got to think that there are hundreds of thousands of these small plaquettes scattered over Europe that have survived, and they're probably a minute fraction of what was created. So the amount of information, I think, is much, much greater than we realize. And we know that the information recorded on these plaquettes is correct, because you will have a cave which will have a collection of plaquettes with it, say with pictures of reindeer on them, for example. These living caves would have living quarters where the plaquettes would be kept, but they would also have butchery sites where the remains of the animals would be kept. And the archaeozoologists examine these bones in these butchery sites, and they can tell you what that animal is and when it was killed, its time of death. And we can then take that information, put it against the plaquettes, And that's our way of proving that the plaquettes are recording real-time information about that cave. Because if the plaquettes are recording, for example, that reindeer are there in, say, late autumn, the archaeozoologists, if there are, can find the reindeer heads and examine the teeth and say, well, actually, this animal was butchered in late August. The time of death is late August. So this is how we construct a lot of our proofs, by actually finding physical evidence that what is said on the plaquettes about the animals is actually confirmed by the anatomical examination of the remains.
Now, the symbol, the sideways Y symbol, that seems to be present in a lot of these tallies, if you can call them tallies, records. Now, this is interesting in a sense that in Chauvet Cave and in the traditions of statuary during this period, we see female forms. And this obviously evokes birth, which would be very important for ancient peoples like this. So that Y symbol looks suspiciously like a birth symbol in that it's parted legs, essentially, birth. Is that what this is? I mean, is that just a very obvious representation of the cycle of life in order to tell people when these animals would give birth?
I think you're right. And in fact, I mean, we use the expressions human animals and non-human animals so that we're separating out these images. In the human animals, you will often have a small statuette where that area of the body is clearly a Y, and it's been infilled with, say, red ochre or black ochre. So they're clearly referencing a human female's birth area. But I think it's more complicated than that. They're recording time of birth, but what is probably more critical is with the animals, they're recording place of birth. So animals will not give birth randomly. An animal will go to the same meadow in the spring and give birth there. This is a constant pattern. So if you know, one of the signs we're working on at the moment is spawning grounds, which obviously have Y. And these are recorded quite carefully. And we think that's a vital food procurement sign, that they're marking these sites, the spawning sites, and that is useful information. You'll have large salmon there with millions of eggs within them, and then they harvest them. So it's meticulously noted all across Europe. We have another idea. We'll never know the exact derivation of Y. We'll never know precisely. I think your suggestion is a very, very sound one. We also think that it might be a metaphor in that you have a single line which then divides and splits into two lines. So that one line becomes two lines, one animal becomes two lines. We think this is true because this occurs with some of the other verbs, that you can deconstruct the graphic image and it will actually tell you what that graphic engraved sign means. The position I take is maybe both of them are true. They're both certainly probable. They certainly both have strong cases for them. And birth is important to these people practically and culturally. And I think that they have created this sign so early on it feels quite logical, especially, as you say, in the context of so many of the animals in the caves are females bursting with life, often pregnant. So why birth, the process of life, the transmission of life, I think is a vital part of this world. It's a vital part of their culture, as well as a practical part of their culture.
Are there still unidentified symbols? Are there still things in these caves that you see that you just don't yet know what they mean?
Yeah, probably 100 or 200, to be honest with you. I mean, we're at the very, very beginning of this. I think it's fair to say that we are the first people that have attached meaning to any of these signs. So we attached meaning to the dots and lines with the animals and demonstrated that is, in all probability, a lunar calendar. And then we use that lunar calendar to demonstrate that the sign Y almost certainly means to give birth. But there are many others. There are dozens of others we're working on, and we've got an idea about some of them, but there are dozens and dozens that we simply have no idea what they're about. But one thing I would say, though, is that if we don't know the meaning of signs, even if you don't know the meaning of sign, you can make the logical conclusion that it's part of a communication system if it is used in consistent patterns of co-occurrence with several other signs, and there are consistent patterns. When we looked at, say, Linear B or other languages like that, or ancient Egyptian, we knew they were writing, even though we couldn't read them because of the consistency of the associations within them. And I think we're at the point now where we're beginning to see those consistent associations. And it's a question of working through and putting a lot of work in and cracking them and working out what they mean. But I think we're at the point now where we pretty confidently say these are communication systems.
Another common theme within caves, and I know that Chauvet has a particularly interesting example of this, is the human handprint. And there it seemed to be the same human making all the handprints because there was a little deformation of the finger. Do you think these have symbolism, or could these simply be the advent of frivolous graffiti? In other words, I'm bored today, I'm just going to make a bunch of handprints. Do we have any indication that these handprints, which are often the only human type form we see in these caves, other than obviously the animals, could that mean something?
I think almost certainly. I mean, you're talking about Chauvet, all those handprints being made by one person, but there are other caves where they are made by many, many different people. I think they have great meaning in that, if you have young children of 2 or 3 and they're in the nursery, one of the things they do is they put their hands into the watercolors and start smearing them on the walls. It's a way of saying, this is me, this is my identity. I'm leaving it's a way of almost making yourself permanent. If you put your handprint on the wall, that is always you on the wall. I think that is probably what they're doing. It's quite a profound thing. It's a sense of self, and a sense of the future. Again, the sense that maybe you have an identity which is outside yourself, that you put that handprint on the wall and someone else could come along and say, oh, that's so-and-so's handprint on the wall, even though you're not there. I think these are quite profound. One thing that the paper came out recently in New Scientist, it came about 3 months ago, where a group of scientists at the French CNRS, which is the French National Research Center, have actually said that in a cave such as Gargus, where you don't get the full presentation of the hand, you'll have various fingers withdrawn, that this is actually some kind of communication system, because they can demonstrate that of the 25 different possible combinations of fingers on one hand, only 10 are used consistently. So therefore, 15 possible combinations are excluded from this system. And they don't know what this system means, but they think the evidence is mounting that these are indicating something, maybe something about the person, say, I'm a male, I'm a female, whatever it might be. But I think there's meaning to what these people do. I think they go into the caves and they leave their handprints there for probably a variety of complex reasons. And I think it shows that they have a grasp of the world beyond themselves, the grasp of the world beyond their immediate time, an understanding that their handprint on the wall might have significance to other people. I think they're quite profound, the handprints. Yeah.
Yeah, my science fiction author side surfaces here in that I imagine if we could pluck one of those people out of that time and bring them forward and take them to Los Angeles and show them the handprints of all of the actors and everything in front of the TLC Chinese Theater, they would understand what the handprint meant and why it was there, but they wouldn't understand the system of writing. So they'd be in the same boat as you are looking at their handprints, right?
I think so. And effectively, they're the same thing. So look, I was here, I'm leaving a permanent record. I can't see a vast difference between the two. They are effectively the same thing. Your hand, in a way, is you. And if you put it into cement or on a wall, it's an external representation of you. I think the two are identified. I think that's a very, very good analogy.
You mentioned a group that's using AI to try and untangle these symbols and their meaning. AI, artificial intelligence. I'm fascinated by this because I know there's a lot of fears about AI, but AI has produced some extraordinary results in recent years. I used to be a chess player, very amateur one, I should say, but there's a chess program called AlphaZero that uses AI principles, plays chess much better than human beings, and very exciting chess. It's not boring chess. There's a program called AlphaFold that predicts the folding of proteins from their DNA sequence, which is a classic problem for human molecular biologists, and they've often taken decades to decode a single sequence to predict how it folds, and this will do thousands a day, I believe. So these can be very powerful tools. There's a recent thing I read about an AI system for diagnosing heart attacks, because doctors often get this wrong, and the AI systems look like they'll be more accurate than the doctors based on the data. So I'm quite interested to know exactly what it seems to me. This is an area where AI might well make a contribution to how we understand all this array of information and these associations that Ben was talking about.
Could I answer that? You might be interested in this, Tony. It's on the web. It's called Signbase, capital S, capital B. And they've been at work since about 2018, roughly. And all their work is on the website, and you can look at it. Now, their basic position, it's a good group. And what they've done is they have a Paleolithic person, they have a computer person, they have a linguistic person, and they've got a couple of others. So it's a multidisciplinary, which I think is the brilliant way to go about this. Now, what they have done is they have not really made much progress, because there's we were able to work this out, I think, because we had the benefits of the calendar and the mathematics. And the calendar doesn't exist that early, so it's not picking up that pattern yet. And the associations, I think it will pick up. It'll pick out the association between X and two parallel lines, or X and one line, something like that. But then you've got to move on to interpretation, don't you? You've got to then have some kind of intuitive flash, or I think what we're doing is that we can work those out, because they're often with the animals in the animal sequences, which we can then demonstrate. You see, it's the calendar is the basis of our proof, I think, which doesn't seem to be in a recognizable form before about 33,000 years ago. See, we have the calendar with the animal, and I think if they have the calendar, it exists in isolation. So you can't really tell if it's a calendar, and you can't tell its context. It's the combination of the two.
Obviously, AI needs a bit of nudging in that direction, and it'll perhaps pick it all up, I mean, it only works on what it's given, doesn't it, really? The information and data it's given, so perhaps give it a little bit more of a nudge, really.
I think so.
And anyway, it's just a rather speculative question, so...
Figuring out protein folding by an AI. I had an AI guest on just last week. That's Nobel Prize material, the work that's being done with AI, because of the complexity, the extreme complexity of protein folding.
Yeah.
Ben, what initially led you into looking deeply into this? What was the spark that began your work?
I've always been interested in writing in Sumerian, in the story of Linear B and Alice Cober's great struggles. I've always been interested in that, and had actually tried to find the beginning of writing, and could get no further back than Sumerian, like most people. But it must be about 7 years ago, a woman called Genevieve von Petzinger wrote a book called The First Signs, which made a huge stir. I don't know if you came across it, but it was, I think it was a bit of a semi-bestseller, in which she made reference to these symbols, saying that the Paleolithic people had symbols, had signs, which, that she put it quite correctly, quite cautiously, might be a form of communication. I was completely unaware of these signs. It's not something you ever encounter in linguistics or the semiotics. Tony and I were with a professor of semiotics at UCL having lunch the other day, and I went and saw him after our visit, and I showed him, I brought my computer and showed him these images. And he, as a linguistic professor, was completely unaware of these signs. He was completely unaware of something like Y, for example. He thought that the Paleolithic period consisted purely of very, very beautiful paintings. He was unaware of this much more complex aspect to it. So when I saw Genevieve von Petzinger's book, and I saw that one of the patterns was the pattern of an animal with dots, this immediately made me think of Sumerian, where the first writing is considered to be a picture of an animal, say a goat or a fish or whatever, with a number with it, which is basically an accountancy document that I'm going to send you 50 goats. Here's the word for goat, here's the word for 50. So the combination of an animal and a number is they think is the start of writing in Sumeria, and it appears to be the start of writing with the Paleolithic people, or certainly one of the beginning drivers of it. So when I saw that and started going on the internet and looking at books, you can see there's a very, very common pattern. Our database was something like 700 examples in the end, which was collected by me, an amateur with no knowledge of the field. But it's very, very quick. It's very quick work to do in a way. And then when you start working with the numbers, you begin to use statistics and data analysis and various mathematical graphs to demonstrate that these numbers are not randomly distributed, that there's a clear patterns of association. And once you have clear patterns of association, you're away. So I sat down one evening, looked at a book on the internet, and within a week I was beginning to collect these. Probably about 6 months later, I went to see Tony to say, this is going to sound extraordinary. And if it is, and it's unbelievable, please tell me. But I think these dots are not random dots, but they are numbers and they constitute a calendar. And then Tony started guiding me and driving me forward at that point.
I think Ben was mostly self-guided, I should say. But when he first came with these ideas, my background was in mathematics. And I just very quickly thought, this is a significant breakthrough, a real breakthrough. But it's come out of a huge amount of work by Ben over, 7 or 8 years now, I think it is. And it's just, he has immersed himself deeply in this subject. Like most scientists who do something of significance, they immerse themselves in a field and then the intuitions and the insights come. And I think that's what's happened with Ben.
Now, immersing yourself into a field. Have either of you, gentlemen, ever been inside one of these caves and directly looked at the cave painting and taken in the environment of something of what the ancient peoples would have lived with as they painted these?
Personally, I haven't. I think I view myself as doing the semiotic work. It's not about art. I mean, I look at art constantly. I look at several thousand images of animals a week. But basically what I'm trying to do, the approach that we used with the calendar of gathering 700 examples, a large amount of data, and then seeing what patterns demonstrate. I think I'm doing that with everything. So if I go to a cave, there'll be a tour guide with me. They'll be very poorly lit because they need to protect the images. You gather very little information. When it's on the internet, I can look at 2,000 images a night. And then you can compile quite complex and detailed databases from that. We want to process as much data as fast as possible, and the internet and books are the tool for that. Going to a cave is slow and laborious. And then we're not, in a sense, interested in atmosphere. We want to work out what these things mean, how these number patterns work. I think a weakness of what has happened before is that people have gone to the caves, have been blown away by the images, and have forgotten to look at the rest in great detail and great depth and great detachment. And that's, I think, working at a distance is not necessarily a bad thing. We also have the advantage that the French and the Spanish will send teams of 10, 12, 15 people into the caves. They'll be led by senior professors, they'll have assistant professors, they'll have imaging specialists, they'll have dating specialists, and they'll spend 8 or 10 years. They'll publish a big, thick book at the end of it with every object from that cave in there. So you can examine the entire corpus as one and get quite a clear picture of what went on in that cave. And that I couldn't do that on my own. I can't spend 10 years at each cave. And I don't have the special skills with imaging and drawing and dating that these people have. It's best just to live off their work, which is what we do, which I think is very sound. It also removes me from interpreting the images. Yeah, and that I think is important. We have to be detached. We have to be scientific. If I went into a cave and came back with 700 of my drawings with dots on them and showed them to Tony, Tony could quite legitimately said, well, these don't have any scientific weight or validity because you've collected them and in poor circumstances, and you might be seeing just what you want to see. But if you go with images that other people have done, then that removes that doubt. I think it's a much sounder way of working.
Identifying confirmation bias is where I was getting, because you've laid out in the paper that there is a lot of statistical things that are hard to ignore here, that this appears to be a real effect rather than seeing what one wants to see, and that there actually is something solid here showing that they had a counting system. My next question for you, though, is this. We see animals. Is there any indicators you've seen of the life cycle of plants, hunter-gatherers? Might they have painted a picture of a berry somewhere and said this is the month, or would they have just inherently known that this stuff is going to show up after the last frost or something like that?
That is just such a brilliant question. And it was just such a snag with us because there are a lot of images of plants and there are a lot of images of plants with numbers. And the numbers with the plants are very restricted. It's 2 to 13. There are no other numbers outside that. There are no outliers. So we have a fantastic number pattern with the plants, which is the numbers we'll get will be typically 2, 4, and say something like 7, 8, which would correspond to early spring, high summer, and then say the foraging time later on in the autumn. So we have a fantastic number pattern there. The problem is they're so bad at drawing plants that we don't know what the plants are. We know they're plants and they're identified as plants, but we can't identify them accurately. We can't say, oh, that's a bean or that's wild garlic, or we can identify a couple. One of the ones we can identify is the white willow, which gives up salicylic acid, which is aspirin. And that's got a spring marker on it, which is when the salicylic acid is at its greatest concentration of strength in the white willow bark. So we have this one great example, but that's the only plant we can identify. It has a good number with it. It's accurate in terms of botany, but you can't do it. It's a real frustration. We need a person who can identify plants from very, very, very bad engravings to help us. But it certainly appears that they were as conversant with plants and their life cycle as they were with the animals in their life cycle.
Sorry, I think it should be said that they weren't exactly vegetarians. Probably meat and animal products, fish and so on, were the essential components of their diet. And I think they celebrated animals. I think the quality of the painting showed they celebrated animals in a way that maybe they didn't celebrate plants so much,
I suspect they were omnivores.
Yeah.
I suspect, a stressed community will eat whatever food is available, and I think that they're probably very practical about that. They'll gather nuts, they'll gather honey, they'll gather salmon, they'll gather reindeer. But certainly, I don't know. I don't know the percentages, but certainly they ate enormous amounts of animals. And they ate enormous amounts of animals that aren't often depicted, like a lot of birds. They ate 70, 80, 90 species of birds. We know this from the butchery sites. And in terms of fish, they ate dozens of different kinds of fish, which again, we know from the butchery sites. So they would, if it was there, they would eat it, I think. They ate a lot of small rodents, hedgehogs and things like that.
This was very much about survival, and we shouldn't forget that the period of how long is the period, Ben, of the total thing? 26,000 years or something?
Well, it starts about 43,000 years ago.
Yeah.
We've got our first marks 43,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe our calendar coming in about 30,000, and it ends about 10,000 years ago. Yeah. So it's a 33,000 year span.
Yeah, and during that period, there were huge climate changes. They lived through ice ages, they lived through warmer periods, and they needed to survive in any way they could. I mean, the harshness of the cold periods, incredible that they survived, to be quite honest, and with the resources they have. And it is all about survival.
And it's about adapting to your environment. As you said, the environment might go from brutal ice ages to something that's relatively benign and relatively warm. And you will have different animals and flora. And you have to learn to shift from, say, a mammoth diet to a red deer diet. And you have to shift from a certain group of plants to a new group of plants, and from a certain group of fish and birds to a new group. And I think it shows our adaptability was one of the main reasons we survived. Paul Pettit, one of our colleagues, wrote a book recently in which he noted that some of the human species that died out, probably died out because they were used to hunting one animal. And when that animal disappeared, they didn't have the adaptability to transition to new food resources. And that effectively led to their end.
I think I'd also like to say that this is like a universal visual language across this huge time span and geography. I don't think we know anything about their spoken language. It seems to be universal across a geography where there must have been probably many spoken languages, but this was a bit like, Chinese characters are read by people who speak Cantonese or Mandarin. They speak them in a very different way, but it's a universal Chinese character set. And I think this visual language, it was like a universal language, whereas I don't think we know anything yet about their spoken language and how they communicated with each other, and how this system was communicated through generations and across geographies. It's just, it does blow your mind when you look at it.
I think Tony's right. And maybe part of this system is to overcome the difficulties of these people speaking different languages. They almost certainly did. They probably have a different language every 50 miles or so. That was certainly the pattern, say, in France in the 18th century, that villages 50 miles apart wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. The dialects would be so... No, it's quite striking. It's... And so that must have been true in this world, that people in Portugal couldn't communicate with people in Russia. But I think of it as like a series of airport signs where you can get on a plane in Portugal speaking Portuguese and land in Bulgaria, but you can still navigate the airport because you see the sign for exit, for train, for customs, for baggage reclaim. It's a kind of semasiacric system where the signs communicate their meaning visually.
Well, you could make the case that we still did that up until relatively recently with things like ecclesiastical Latin being the universal language between scientists and correspondence and things like that, or German for chemistry. We have examples in our modern culture of doing that where you have a universal system, but it doesn't have to be complex enough to be a language. It's just a message instead, right?
I think so. And I think that's a very good, that's a very, very good point. It might explain part of the iconography of the cave as well, that if you look at these images, as Tony's pointed out, they are remarkably similar. You would expect vast differences, but they will draw the fish the same. One of the species we really focus on is fish, because there are a lot of images of fish. And fish evolves into quite abstract, simplified signs, if you like. These simplified signs are not local, they're universal across all of Europe. And this simplification of the system, this universality of the system, allows these people not only to communicate with each other, but to understand they have a shared culture. If you go into a Christian church, pretty much anywhere in the world, the language of that church is the same. You'll have the central aisle, you have the altar, you'll have the crucifix at the end. And that's partly a way of making you understand where you are immediately. And I think the caves are partly about that as well, that even we go into caves, we recognize that they have a similar layout and iconography. And I imagine, as well as being great art, they're great cultural unifiers. You feel at home with these people. You know that you're the same as these people because you have a cave like this back where you come from.
I think it's fascinating because we do. And they really do, in some respects, feel like cathedrals, these cave paintings. They seem to fulfill a similar role because hunter-gatherers tend to place religious significance on that which they hunt. So there's a certain reverence that seems to be present in the cave paintings, but also a practicality. Well, it works like a church because, in medieval churches, the whole point of the stained glass was to tell biblical stories, again, to telescope a message, which has telescoped for 2,000 years as far as Christianity goes. So it's sort of the same idea, and it gives us an insight into the mind of people 42,000 years ago. And I just still, to this day, find that absolutely amazing. All right, gentlemen, we are out of time, and I appreciate you both joining us for this discussion today. And I hope with further work, you're able to figure out even more and come back.
We're working hard.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.